At least 30 Palestinians, including women and children, have reportedly been killed in strikes on Nuseirat. According to the Gaza Civil Defense Agency, it comes amid reports of 8 trucks from Egypt being looted amid a continued concern over famine. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has hailed Donald Trump's determination after the US president has announced a new 10 to 12-day deadline for Vladimir Putin to agree to a ceasefire. Russian strikes have been reported at a prison in Zaporizhzhia region, killing at least 17 people. Indian Home Minister Amit Shah says that 3 of the terrorists that carried out the tragic April 22nd Pahalgam attack have now been killed by Kashmiri forces. The announcement comes as India's lower house has been discussing Operation Sindoor at length in Parliament. A police officer is among the casualties after a shooting inside a Manhattan skyscraper before the gunman turns on the gun to himself. NYPD have identified the suspect as 27-year-old Shane Tamura of Las Vegas, with 4 others killed. China says it firmly opposes any visit to the US by Taiwan's leader, urging prudence. It comes after reports suggest that President Lai Ching-te is reportedly set to delay a stopover in the US due to ongoing US-China trade talks. Top US and Chinese economic officials have now met in Stockholm, holding talks for more than 5 hours, aiming to resolve long-standing trade disputes. President Donald Trump says he may visit President Xi, though the US leader says he is not seeking a summit with his Chinese counterpart. The Netherlands has declared Israeli Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich and Israeli National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir persona non grata for inciting violence. The move marks a rare European diplomatic condemnation against 2 of Israel's most hardline ministers amid the ongoing war in Gaza. Iran has warned the US and Israel over any future attacks on the country, Tehran stating it will not hesitate with retaliation. Tensions have been rising over Iran's nuclear program, with the 12-day war with Israel seeing strikes on Iran's nuclear program. Israeli Foreign Minister Gideon Sa'ar has termed reports of starvation in Gaza a lie, while admitting that the situation in the Palestinian territory remains tough. Let's listen into what the Israeli Foreign Minister had to say.
First of all, it is clear that after almost 2 years of war, the situation is tough. But there is a lie, and the lie is the starvation policies which the international media, including BBC, is cooperating with. First of all, who is responsible for this tough reality? I answered, this is Hamas. Whether there is a starvation policy, no, the contrary is right. We are doing amazing efforts, including this week, by opening these humanitarian corridors, by airdrops, by any possible means. By the way, in the contrary of the lie that's spread in Western media, or part of it, we are not limiting. We are facilitating for everyone to help.
Israel's Foreign Minister Gideon Sa'ar also rejected today what he called a distorted campaign of international pressure for a ceasefire in Gaza and recognition of a Palestinian state. Speaking to reporters, Sa'ar said that halting the war while Hamas remains in power and still holds hostages would be a tragedy for both Israelis and Palestinians. Sa'ar also insisted that Hamas is solely responsible for the conflict, adding that outside pressure would only harden the group's position. He further criticized foreign moves to revive a two-state solution, warning that establishing a Palestinian state today would amount to creating a Hamas state or a jihadist state. Israel's military campaign in Gaza has been ongoing for nearly 22 months now, following the deadly October 7, 2023 attack by Hamas. International pressure has intensified in recent weeks to reach a ceasefire and allow aid into Gaza, where a UN-backed monitor now warns of an unfolding famine. Now we're joined by Ross Feingold. He's a political analyst, joins us live from Taipei. Thank you, Ross, for joining us as always. Thank you very much. Now, while the Israeli foreign minister has denied these claims of starvations, the visuals and many international media say otherwise. So what are the potential risks of such
consistent Israeli position, which also includes that they have allowed aid in, and that the aid is often hijacked by Hamas or other criminal organizations? Of course, with increasing international attention, whether that's media attention or critical foreign governments, insisting that there isn't a starvation problem is not going to get a welcome in many capitals around the world, increasingly so. We see that with the willingness of countries that previously were very friendly to Israel are now willing to criticize Israel openly, and specifically with regard to the food situation in Gaza. So there's certainly some risk for the Israeli government to take this position. However, again, I think it should be emphasized, and I'll repeat what I said previously about this topic here on NewsX, is that it does seem that Prime Minister Netanyahu is sensitive to the growing international criticism. His ministers, they have the luxury of commenting without being the person in charge, but ultimately Netanyahu is the prime minister, and I think there has been a little bit of movement on his part in the last couple of days, such as by allowing the airdrop or agreeing to allow more aid in by truck.
From what we know, is there any public denial within Israel for such? Are there people supporting Israel's this claim that this is not happening, starvation is not happening, and for this minister's particular criticizement?
Israel is a democracy, and like any other democratic society, there's a range of opinions. Certainly, there's a large number of people in Israel who support the government's positions. They support the government's conduct of the war, and they want the government to continue to fight Hamas until Hamas is completely defeated. Now, there are also many people who criticize the Netanyahu government. They didn't vote for the coalition. The coalition barely won the last election, but was able to win enough seats to form the governing coalition. But there are many Israelis who never liked Netanyahu and his governing coalition. And we know throughout the period of the war, whether it's with regard to bringing hostages back or the general conduct of the war, that there's certainly been many voices in Israel critical of the government as well.
Thank you, Ross, for sharing that. Please stay with us as we stay on this topic. Over half of the Egyptian aid trucks that entered Gaza on Sunday were looted, with their contents later sold in local markets, according to UK-based Al Arabi Al Jadid. Of the 130 trucks that crossed via Rafah, 73 were reportedly looted near the Morag axis in an area under Israeli control. Only 37 trucks reached warehouses managed by the Palestinian Red Crescent and Egyptian Committee. Another 20 trucks were sent back to Rafah by Israel for unknown reasons. The IDF has not commented yet. This marked the first Egyptian aid delivery through Rafah since Israel took control in May, and coincided with the launch of Israel's 10-hour daily humanitarian pauses. Former U.S. envoy David Satterfield warned that Red Crescent and aid lacks international accountability, making it more prone to looting compared to UN-distributed aids. Now we go back to our guest discussion with Ross Feingold. Thank you, Ross, for staying with us. Now, this looting of aid shipment area under Israeli control actually raises questions about accountability, and also, if it's under Israel control, is it possible for people to loot local people without, maybe they had, I don't know, how did they loot? Do you have any information on that?
This really depends on the willingness of the Israeli military to escort these aid trucks point to point. Apparently, the Israeli government or the military is not willing to do that yet at the moment, and it might require additional international pressure. At the moment, Israel and its military is let those trucks in through the Rafah crossing from Egypt, but it looks like it then stood down and let the trucks drive in to the warehouse or attempt to drive into the warehouses on their own. And it appears that the Israeli military view is they're not going to risk their own soldiers escorting those trucks point to point. So again, I think Israel is probably going to come under international pressure that it does need to escort those trucks point to point, and we'll see how the Israeli military and government react to and whether or not they're willing to do that.
And Ross, do you think this incident could damage trust between the Palestinian authorities and Egyptian authorities, as well as international aid organizations?
That's a really good question, and obviously time will tell in the coming days. And of course, there's a role for Israel in this as well. Like I said, there's an important issue here of Israel's willingness to escort those aid trucks and also to continue to allow them to enter. But for the Palestinian Red Crescent and any other organization within Gaza that's trying to facilitate the acceptance and then the distribution of this aid, they really have no choice. Israel is willing to let in this aid from the Egyptian side, and the Red Crescent is going to have to work with what becomes available. They don't really have a choice to say we don't want it, so they have to accept this aid if Egypt is willing to provide it, and the Israeli military is willing to allow it through the crossing. But again, clearly there's an issue with the safety of these trucks after they cross the Rafah crossing into Gaza.
Thank you for sharing that, Ross. Please stay with us as we come back to you for our next discussion as well. Now, the United Nations World Food Programme has warned that the humanitarian disaster unfolding in Gaza is reminiscent of the famines in Ethiopia as well as Biafra in the last century. WFP Program Director Ross Smith urged for urgent action. His comments came after the UN-backed Integrated Food Security Phase Classification Initiative, or IPC, has said that the worst-case scenario of famine is now unfolding in the Gaza Strip. The IPC said immediate unimpeded humanitarian access is needed to prevent a rapid increase in starvation and death. The group said famine thresholds have been reached in most of Gaza, though it stopped short of issuing a formal famine declaration. Meanwhile, UN Women has warned that 1 million women and girls in Gaza are facing mass starvation, violence, and abuse. The agency also said that malnutrition is soaring and essential services have now collapsed. Now we go back to our guest discussion with Ross Feingold. He's a political analyst. Thank you, Ross, for staying with us. Now, what's your reaction to this this news and warnings set by UN as well as other organizations about the starvation?
Clearly, there's a food shortage in Gaza, and I think anyone who would deny that would be very foolish to do so, regardless of what political office they're holding in Israel or supporters of the Israeli government. Clearly, due to the blockade and the limited amounts of aid that have been allowed in over the past few months, there's a shortage of food. But I think some of these organizations need to be a little bit careful, because comparing it to some of the examples they cited, whether that's Biafra or Ethiopia in the last century, I think there's some risk there. It's just simply not established yet that the scale of the food shortage or the malnutrition in Gaza has reached that level, especially now with limited amounts of aid resuming. The situations that they compare it to are ones in which tens of thousands or even more people died of malnutrition or starvation. And that's not the situation in Israel, in Gaza yet. And frankly, I think it's going to, when they make those comparisons, it only causes the Israeli government to go into denial and become more hardline. And that's just not conducive to getting aid into Gaza and to the people who need it. So again, I would caution those organizations against making those comparisons if they're not really supported yet by the facts.
And now, to prevent further catastrophe, what political and logistical challenges are standing in the way of ensuring this access to the starving Gazans there?
That's a really good question, and it's been such a matter of heated debate over the last few months because Israel and the United States launched this Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which was a newly formed organization with very little experience doing this. They were rushed into Gaza, but only allowed to operate a limited number, a very small number of distribution centers. And although the World Food Program and World Kitchen have had some limited access to Gaza over the preceding few months as well, generally Israel is not allowing certain organizations that have experience with this kind of thing to operate in Gaza. So the chain, the logistical chain, the distribution chain really needs to be set up again almost from scratch. And that's at a time when there are still hostilities ongoing. We have to keep in mind that Hamas and the IDF are still fighting each other in many places in Gaza. And again, that just shows the importance of reaching a ceasefire. As soon as there's a ceasefire, then it'll be safer to deliver aid. And again, I think Israel will be under international pressure and will be responsive to that to allow more organizations that have experience with distribution of aid back into the Gaza Strip. But we're clearly not there yet, especially in the absence of a ceasefire.
Thank you very much, Ross, for joining us and sharing your expertise as a political analyst. Now we move on to our next news. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says 22 people were killed and 85 injured in Russian strikes over the past day, including 5 killed in the northeastern Kharkiv region. The attacks come amid increased pressure from U.S. President Donald Trump, who has given Moscow a 10 to 12-day deadline to accept a ceasefire or face new sanctions on Russian exports. Trump abandoned a longer 50-day deadline, saying there is no reason to wait, given Putin's repeated rejections of a truce. The Kremlin has not responded officially, but top Russian figures called the deadline an ultimatum, with former President Medvedev warning it could be a step towards war. President Trump, frustrated by lack of progress after multiple calls with Putin, said he's no longer interested in talking to the Russian leader. Now we're joined by Keith Vaz. He's a former UK minister, joins us live from London. Thank you, Keith, for joining us today. Good to see you. Now, given President Trump's deadline for Russia to accept this ceasefire or face new sanctions, we also talked about this yesterday, but do you think this approach is effective, or is there any counterproductive arrangement that could be made?
Good afternoon. Well, good morning from London. Mr. Trump, President Trump, thinks that putting deadlines is the best way of achieving peace in Ukraine. It is not. All it does is upsets the Russians, and it makes the Ukrainians very nervous, because if the deadline isn't met, then the West looks weak. So I'm not sure why he's decided to put this deadline on. He has. The reaction of the Russians is to go further, to bomb further, to kill more people in their attacks. And the reaction of Volodymyr Zelensky, which is understandable, is to complain about the fact that the Russians have no interest in having a ceasefire. So diplomacy is hard. Anyone who watches NewsX and sees the experts who come on here will know that they are very experienced people. You have to speak relatively slowly. You have to understand the position of the other side, and you have to make progress. Very little progress has been made since Donald Trump has become president. I think he has the capacity to make progress, but the carrot and stick approach used very often by this particular president is just not working. You need to sit down, negotiate, have a proper discussion at prime ministerial, presidential level. So that means, and he'll love this, convening a meeting in a place like Iceland to give you an example. Or he's very fond of Greenland, maybe Greenland. Bring President Putin there, have Zelensky there, with President Trump present as well. That is the only way you're going to get to a solution here. Phone calls are not working, deadlines are not working. Deadlines will change and people will think the United States is very weak. Diplomacy is hard. It's every little dot, every crossing of the T. It's got to be done very carefully.
Yes, and also Russian figures. You have also touched on that they will see this ultimatum as negative. Can you tell us more about what's the point of view from Russian figures? How is this warning seen? Is it seen as a good thing, bad thing?
They care about the warnings because they realize that what can we do more to the Russians than we have done to them in the last few years? Let's face it, sanctions have been operating for a number of years. They've been banned from the World Cup. They can't participate in international organizations. The G8 has become the G7. I mean, what more can you actually do to the Russians? I'm not sure that there is. And therefore, deadlines of this kind are not effective unless they are backed up with a proper end game. And there doesn't seem to be an end game here.
Thank you very much for sharing that. Please stay with us as we come back to you in a minute. Now we move on to our next news. Russia's flagship airline Aeroflot is facing major disruption after a massive cyber attack forced the cancellation of dozens of flights. The airline says its schedule is now stable, but the damage was done. Two pro-Ukraine hacking groups claimed responsibility, saying they spent a year penetrating Aeroflot's network, gaining control of 7,000 servers and even the computers of senior managers. On Monday, nearly 60 round-trip flights from Moscow were all cancelled, followed by over 50 on Tuesday. Passengers faced long delays and confusion. Russian lawmakers are demanding accountability, calling the attack a wake-up call for cybersecurity. Now we go back to our guest discussion with Keith Vaz. He's a former UK minister, joins us live from London. Thank you, Keith, for staying with us. Now, how does the UK and European Union view this growing threat of cyber warfare, which is close to them in Moscow?
It is a huge threat. It's probably the biggest threat other than terrorism against nations such as ours and others. And obviously the Russians are on the receiving end of this. There is a cyber attack probably every hour somewhere in the EU, and countries are just not able to put their fingers in the various holes because it could happen everywhere and anywhere. So it is essential that we act swiftly to try and get some kind of common approach to this. When I chaired the Home Affairs Select Committee in the British Parliament a few years ago, we did suggest that the City of London Police, which takes responsibility for dealing with these cyber attacks, creates a state-of-the-art cyber centre. It takes a lot of money to do this. If you go to the newsroom of NewsX, you will see a lot of television screens on the wall as the producers look and see where all the cameras are. That's actually how it should be done. I'm not suggesting that NewsX should take over dealing with cybersecurity for the European Union, but I'm saying it takes a lot of money, a lot of equipment, a lot of very careful monitoring to deal with this. Yes, you can have computers to deal with it, but at the end of the day, you do need experts.
Yeah.
It is a growing area. In our universities and in our colleges, this is becoming one of the most popular subjects, dealing with cybercrime and cyber strategies. So there is hope for the future. But as it currently stands, I'm afraid it's very difficult to do preventative work. There are companies and governments that are prepared to try and prevent this from happening. But as we can see, they've been working for a whole year on trying to hack the Aeroflot systems. They managed to succeed, but it could be very dangerous if you have a flight going out and you then hack the way in which the flight operates. Very serious matters, and therefore it needs to be taken very seriously.
Yes, and thank you very much, Keith Vaz, for always joining us and sharing your insight as a former UK minister. Now we move on to our next news. US and Chinese officials are holding a second day of trade talks in Stockholm, aiming to cool tensions between the world's top two economies. The 90-day extension of their tariff truce is on the table, with an August 12th deadline fast approaching. Any failure to reach a deal could reignite tariffs and disrupt global supply chains. The talks follow President Donald Trump's recent deals with the EU and Japan. Meanwhile, Washington is weighing sanctions over human rights issues, and Taiwan's planned U.S. visit has been delayed to avoid flaring tensions. Trump denies actively seeking a meeting with Xi Jinping, though one may still happen later this year. Now we're joined by Joshua Barnes. He's our anchor and correspondent at NewsX World. Joshua, what more can you tell us about this situation?
Well, yes, Asuma, these talks are the third round of direct talks between US and Chinese delegations since the blow-up of a huge trade conflict between the largest two economies in the world. The first set of talks holding place in Geneva and then in London, where this truce of sorts was agreed, which was seeing those tariff rates dramatically reduced from three-digit figures imposed on both countries by each other down to much more minimal figures. The situation now is looking at continuation of that. There are still some sticking points. Rare earth minerals is a huge point of conjecture and an issue that has been resolved previously through discussions in those talks that I mentioned earlier. Rare earths are so significant because they're vital in many of the electronic goods that have now become part of everyone's everyday life. China is a huge exporter of those, a huge producer of those, and impacts of rare earths, if they were limited and sales were limited, would have massive effects on the economy. But aside from that, of course, this is Donald Trump's tariff policy. We've seen Trump's Liberation Day on April the 2nd. This has now moved closer towards a deadline. China's deadline to agree a deal with the US is April the 12th. We know what Trump is like. Ultimately, he can change his mind on these decisions. Even his top officials saying that these deadlines are fixed, but if there is conversation still ongoing, then they could move. Ultimately, the situation remains the same between China and the US. Conversations are taking place with relationships in a better point than they have been since the early parts of Donald Trump's second term in office. One to keep an eye on, conversations still to be had, and a potential meeting between Trump and President Xi in the offing. We'll bring you all those updates as we get them.
Thank you, Joshua Barnes, for sharing that insight. Now, well, that's all we have time